Welcome back to the conversation. It's more Adrienne Lawrence, and this time we are going to stay north of the equator, and we're going to talk about Joe Biden and some documents. Yes, and helping me out with this conversation is Washington bureau chief for The Guardian, David Smith. Thanks for joining us, David.
Thank you.
Yeah, so toward the close of last week, we learned that Biden is under more scrutiny because there was a second batch of classified documents reportedly found in his possession in some way. Provide us with an update.
That's right. So, say it ain't so, Joe. I think what's been striking about the Biden administration so far is very scandal-free, very leak-proof, a huge contrast with the Donald Trump White House, and you could feel the reporters and the White House press corps who've been starving for all this time. Suddenly, they've got some meat to sink their teeth into. There were those first Biden classified documents at his think tank in Washington, and then a few days later, the revelation of a second batch. This time at his home in Delaware, mostly in a garage, as I would pronounce it in my British accent, near his Corvette car. And I think, 2 points here. One is the White House has not handled this brilliantly. Normally, this kind of situation, it's best to get all the information out there, and instead, it's been coming bit by bit. And there's, I've been to some of those White House press briefings where there's a barrage of questions for Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary. She's not really at liberty to say much in terms of, how did those documents get there? How many are there? Why did the White House not announce this earlier? And of course, the other crucial point here, it's ammunition for Republicans and Donald Trump. I think even though the two cases are very different with Mar-a-Lago, nevertheless, this certainly muddies the waters.
Absolutely. And again, as you had mentioned, I know we don't know that much in terms of detail, but it does seem kind of strange how we had come off of weeks of the Republicans' nonsense, particularly with their election of a House Speaker. And then all of a sudden, now it seems that the camera lens is turning to Joe Biden in this classified document situation, especially in the wake of Donald Trump and his classified document. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I think in politics, the tide turns that way. You have two major parties. You see these patterns where one is up for a long time and it seems can do no wrong. The other's in disarray, and it just takes one unexpected event to flip around the narrative. What's been interesting is that Joe Biden's been on a great run. Particularly last year, he got big climate legislation passed, other measures on gun safety, work for military veterans, the infrastructure bill, and so on. People are saying this was the most consequential presidency for years, if not decades, and some bipartisan achievements. And of course, very tellingly, did much better than people expected in the midterms. Democrats held the Senate, a narrow defeat in the House, better than historical trends suggested, and it really was doom for Republicans, and talk of Donald Trump being ejected from being the most powerful figure there, and all of that may still happen. This, I think, Republicans will be absolutely delighted that after yet another chaotic week with the election of the House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, after 15 rounds and a week, finally they get some respite here. Finally, they've been thrown a lifeline just when they least expected it. The way that those political events erupt, every White House makes mistakes. This was one for Biden. I don't think one, or you could argue two mistakes like this with classified materials suddenly changes the narrative, and now it's all doom and gloom for Biden. We speak at a moment where his approval rating has actually been ticking up. Inflation is slowing. There's still a lot of positives for this White House, but certainly it does give Republicans a bit of impetus and momentum as they take control of the House and they have this Biden issue to attack.
Absolutely, because I know that one of their agenda items was definitely to attack Joe Biden, but of course by way of his son, not necessarily him in any form or fashion, but now this kind of gives them something that is more directly tied to Joe Biden himself. But also, it does make us question, would this actually be an issue that is warranting of as much media attention as it's getting if it weren't for Donald Trump being under investigation for having the classified documents in his possession that it seems that he was intentionally withholding, which seems very much a different situation than what we know so far with Joe Biden. And I would argue that it would generally not be that big of a deal otherwise. You agree?
I think in so many ways we've seen Joe Biden and Donald Trump's fates intertwined, including the question of whether one or both will run again and actually get the nominations in 2024. And certainly in this case, the idea of possession of classified material is now in the ether thanks to Trump. So of course, when Biden, even if it's a small number of documents, we're told that sort of flares up into a big issue. I think, as I was saying earlier as well, it is also in a context where there's been very little controversy and scandal, relatively, really, around Joe Biden and this White House. So, here at last is what appears to be a significant misstep that the media can seize on. I think the other important point here is that in terms of the legal situation, probably doesn't change much for the Trump investigation. His case is much more serious in terms of significantly more documents were at Mar-a-Lago, and even after some were handed over, his associates fiercely resisted the National Archives, even a Justice Department subpoena to hand over the rest. I mean, the FBI literally had to go to Mar-a-Lago themselves with a search warrant to obtain the rest, and that warrant shows accusations of obstruction of justice and so on. However, there's reality and then there's perception, and I think the perception is going to be very important here. I do think for your average voter who is not following every twist and turn, not following every nuance and subtlety of these issues, I think it's they will see the Biden and Trump situations as very similar now. Trump will make much of that at his campaign rallies. I think this probably does mostly neutralize the issue in terms of Democrats being able to criticize Trump.
It's unfortunate because I think that anybody who sees any similarity between these two issues is engaging in intellectual dishonesty. But we know that generally a lot of individuals who have backed the far right wing of the GOP have had no issue with intellectual dishonesty. And also, it doesn't even require nuance as far as I'm concerned. But then again, people will justify their disdain for the president in any way in which they can. But I do find it to be rather interesting because, again, it seems that these documents were located, and to our knowledge, that Joe Biden's attorneys automatically contacted National Archives and whomever needed to know, and followed all the processes and procedures, and was very open and forthright about what was going on. And the reality is that these things kind of happen, and I can't see Joe Biden necessarily being the type to engage in the same antics that Trump would in terms of obstruction of justice with the classified documents in any way. And I'm wondering, do you think that the average American who is participating in these polls about Joe Biden and whether they support his presidency will also have the ability to distinguish? Or do you think that they are going to see them as being the same in terms of Trump and Joe Biden?
I think you make an important point that yes, Biden's lawyers did the exact opposite of Trump's, and they immediately contacted the National Archives and handed them over. They did the right thing, but as I touched on earlier, I do suspect that in the general hurly-burly of political discourse, vast majority of Americans, like in any other country, they're busy doing the school run, they're shopping, they're doing their work, they've got other things that they're not following every twist and turn. The vague headline, the concept will be Joe Biden had classified documents, Donald Trump had classified documents. It's a tie, a plague on both their houses, and they won't care too much about the details. And I just think back to the 2016 presidential election, for example, where Republicans showed their mastery of the dark arts of this kind of whataboutism, this kind of drawing a moral equivalence. So in that instance, on the one hand, you had Hillary Clinton's private email server. On the other, you had Donald Trump allegedly colluding with Vladimir Putin and Russia. And you had lots of other Trump misdemeanors as well. But again, they managed to frame it so both sides of that got pretty got a pretty similar media coverage, and it neutralized a lot of problems for Trump. So yes, I'm afraid I do think Democrats are now going to struggle to land many blows on Trump over the Mar-a-Lago documents issue, because there'll be immediate blowback. But what about Biden and his Corvette and his garage?
It's unfortunate, and people need kind of that analogy out there in terms of people getting audited on their taxes. It's very different than someone who is engaged in tax evasion. But hey, I can't get everyone to think logically or to engage in intellectual dishonesty. I can just avoid them like the plague. But in terms of next steps and what the Justice Department should do you think that this situation with Joe Biden is going to impact their prosecution of Trump in terms of whether they think that they could actually get a guilty verdict should they proceed with an indictment and seeking a conviction?
I would hope not. I think the legal situation should remain pure, and Merrick Garland's actually done a good job of appointing special counsels in both cases, and I think he probably only did it in the Trump case because of the political sensitivities. But Jack Smith investigating Trump, I think will play this straight. Now, if charges are brought, that might be a more difficult sell politically. You might see a lot of backlash from Republicans. But in essence, I think the Justice Department are super mindful of the situation. So I would expect the investigation and potential prosecution to go ahead.
All right. Well, we will have to wait and see. But in the meantime, where can our viewers find you and follow more of your work?
I'm at theguardian.com. David Smith, I'm the Washington bureau chief, and yes, just been writing about this classified documents issue and much else that's going on in American politics.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. That's David Smith, Washington bureau chief for The Guardian.